Okay, so Norbert is said to look like a crumpled black umbrella, a long snout with wide nostrils, stubs of horns, and orange eyes. So... Spoiler warning, this is an in-depth retrospective and story analysis of the entirety of the Harry Potter books, one chapter at a time. If this is your first video in the series, it is highly recommended that you begin watching this series from the beginning, which you can do by going to the playlist that I provide right here. Okay, now that everyone is all caught up, let's continue. The Golden Trio start this chapter off by studying like mad in the library. You know, considering that this is only their first year, I have to wonder how they managed to do all their homework in subsequent years if this year is so taxing on them. However, the actual plot of this chapter gets underway when Ron spots Hagrid in the library, which is apparently a big deal. The Golden Trio explained that they had found out who Nicholas Flamel was. Hagrid starts to panic and offers to talk to them in the privacy of his own home about it if they'll agree to shut up about it in public. Harry notices that Hagrid was in a section of the library dedicated to learning how to care for dragons. One has to wonder how Harry could have determined that was what Hagrid was researching just because of the general area of the library Hagrid was in. What, was the entire aisle dedicated to nothing but dragon breeding books? If so, that's a lot of books for Hogwarts to have for such a niche topic that isn't even legal. Anyway, the trio head off to Hagrid's hut, and the first thing they notice is how blistering hot it is inside. It's a nice warm day, which is something I have to scratch my head at. The beginning of this chapter was said to take place 10 weeks before their exams. The exams obviously take place in late June, so this conversation must be taking place in early to mid-April. Well, according to a Google search, temperatures in April in the UK tend to be an average high of 54 degrees Fahrenheit and an average low of 39 degrees Fahrenheit. So it should not be so warm outside that a fire makes absolutely no sense. Anyway, Hagrid refuses to tell them anything else about the Sorcerer's Stone, because they know too much as it is. He's still dumbfounded that they even know about Fluffy, but that's honestly the one part of the stone's protection that was the easiest for them to find out. Fluffy is the first line of defense against the stone, and all you have to do is press your ear up against the door to the Forbidden Corridor to hear a dog growling, so you don't even have to enter the corridor to know about him. Now, if Hagrid is supposed to be astonished that the trio know about Fluffy and lived to tell about it, that's another story. As I mentioned back in Chapter 9, it was entirely contrived that Fluffy didn't attack them right away. But that just means that, by writing Hagrid so that he wonders that, Rowling is effectively admitting that her own plot makes no sense. That said, Hagrid does agree to tell the trio about the other teachers who were helping to guard the stone, even if he doesn't tell them about the obstacles themselves. He name-drops Sprout, Flitwick, McGonagall, Quirrell, Dumbledore himself, and Snape. He insists that Snape isn't trying to steal the stone because he's one of the teachers helping to protect it. However, the same is true for Quirrell, so clearly that doesn't prove anything. However, all talks of the stone suddenly cease when Harry and Ron spot a dragon egg inside the fire. Ron points out that the dragon egg must have cost a fortune, and it's easy to see why. Because dragon breeding is illegal, the black market is the only place Hagrid could have gotten one. One need only look to the illegal drugs industry to see how the black market can jack up prices. However, Hagrid points out that he didn't buy the egg, but won it in a game of cards the previous night. While that does seem a little convenient, I can't really call it a plot hole or a contrivance, since its convenience will be used 2 chapters from now to advance the plot, and the characters will even call attention to how convenient it is. That being said, I do have to wonder how Quirrell got a hold of the Dragon Egg himself. He should have been at Hogwarts tending to his duties as Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. When did he have time to leave the country to get a Dragon Egg? Was it before the start of the school year? If so, how did they keep the Dragon Egg from dying for so many months when Hagrid has to constantly keep the egg in blazing hot temperatures in order to keep it from dying? A few days later, Hagrid sends them a letter telling them that it's hatching. He obviously doesn't say what it is in case the letter gets intercepted, so clearly Hagrid knows that what he's doing is super illegal. The Golden Trio debate whether to go see the egg hatching. Hermione is worried that they'll get into trouble, but they really won't. It's perfectly legal to visit the gamekeeper during the day. However, their discussion comes to a screeching halt when Harry notices that Malfoy overheard their discussion, and sure enough, when they visit Hagrid and see the dragon hatching, they notice that Malfoy was peeking in the window and saw the dragon that Hagrid had hatched. What's really bizarre about this turn of events is that Malfoy never actually attempts to blackmail a Golden Trio. There's one instance he sort of blackmails them, which I'll get to in a minute, but it doesn't make any sense. He struts around the castle with a shit-eating grin on his face, but he never actually does anything with this highly incriminating evidence he's discovered, which makes no sense. Hagrid names the dragon Norbert, and refuses to get rid of him. It's also said that Hagrid is shirking his gamekeeping duties because the dragon is keeping him so busy. So even if Malfoy doesn't report the dragon, it would only be a matter of time before Dumbledore comes knocking to find out what's keeping Hagrid from doing his job. Now that Hermione is replacing Ron as the emotional support of the group, Ron is now relegated to mere comic relief, and this is the first instance where he fills that role. Since Neville isn't even in this chapter at all, Ron gets to look like a complete dumbass when Harry gets Charlie as an idea, and he assumes that Ron is addressing him as Charlie. Ron, he's been calling you Ron for months now. What honestly makes you think he suddenly just forgot your name? Well, anyway, it was explained all the way back in Chapter 6 that Charlie had taken up a job breeding dragons in Romania, so Harry gets the idea to send Norbert to live with Charlie. Since Hagrid realizes that he has to get rid of Norbert just to save his own skin, he agrees to let Charlie take him. A week later, Ron comes into the common room with Harry's invisibility cloak. Strangely enough, this is the first of only 2 instances in the entire series when somebody other than Harry uses the cloak without Harry also using it, and the only time when someone else uses it with Harry's permission. Not a major trivia, but I figured I'd point that out. Anyway, Ron points out that Norbert actually bit his hand. Right after that rant, Hedwig shows up with Charlie's response. One has to wonder why she chose midnight to arrive, instead of waiting until the next morning. It sure is a good thing Harry just happened to still be awake that night. In any event, Charlie agrees to take Norbert. Only problem is that the dragon is already super illegal, and it's going to be nearly impossible getting him there without anyone else noticing. So he enters into a conspiracy with his little brother and some friends of his to engage in an illegal act of dragon smuggling. Keep that in mind because it's important to a rant I have later in this chapter. So the next day, Ron goes to the hospital wing to get treated for his dragon bite. He told Pomfrey that he suffered a dog bite, and then we get to the one instance of blackmail that Malfoy actually attempts in this chapter. He wants one of Ron's books. What exactly he plans to do with that book is anyone's guess. Sure, it ends up containing Charlie's letter, but how does Malfoy know about that? But that's not what makes this so dumb. No, the problem is that he doesn't blackmail Ron to get the book. He blackmails Pomfrey. Ron very clearly says Malfoy told Madame Pomfrey he wanted to borrow one of my books so he could come and have a good laugh at me. This begs the question, how does Pomfrey get the authority to lend one of Ron's books out on Ron's behalf? This would have made so much more sense if Malfoy made those threats to Ron. It still would have begged the question of just what Malfoy was hoping to get out of this book, seeing as he had no way of knowing about Charlie's letter, but at least it would have made some sense. So then we get to the section where Harry and Hermione actually smuggle Norbert up to the astronomy tower. Now I want to make this perfectly clear. Harry and Hermione are not the good guys here. Up until this point, the Golden Trio's only involvement in Hagrid's dragon smuggling has been knowing about Hagrid's crime and not reporting it to anyone, which is far less damning than actively participating in the crime itself. But now, they are actively participating in an illegal act of dragon smuggling themselves. They know full well that their actions are super illegal, as evidenced by the fact that they are using the invisibility cloak and the fact that Charlie himself said it was illegal. In the future, whenever Harry does a crime, he usually has a good reason for it. He realizes that Voldemort is close to acquiring the Sorcerer's Stone. He has a lead on the Chamber of Secrets and has to break curfew in order to save Ginny's life and keep Hogwarts from shutting down. He breaks into Gringotts in order to get one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. But what's their reason for committing this crime? They want to prevent Hagrid from suffering a punishment they know damn well he rightly deserves to suffer. Oh yeah, real noble motive there, Harry. Real noble motive. So that being said, you can imagine my irritation when Harry and Hermione overhear Malfoy trying to warn Professor McGonagall about the dragon, only to get detention for it. As the audience, we are obviously intended to think, well, this couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Finally, he gets some comeuppance. However, that's not how I feel about this turn of events at all. If Malfoy had gotten detention for any of his shenanigans back in Chapter 9 or Chapter 13, then it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Those are the instances when Malfoy was actually being a bully. But here, because he went to Professor McGonagall, a teacher who I have already heavily criticized for being the biggest bitch in all of Hogwarts, that means that the one time in this book when Malfoy gets fully held accountable for his actions is also the one time in this book when he is unequivocally doing a good thing by trying to stop a crime from being committed. Now, sure, McGonagall doesn't seem to believe Malfoy, so you could argue that this isn't Malfoy being punished for doing good so much as it is McGonagall making an honest mistake by assuming that Malfoy is up to no good. However, you can't actually make that argument, and you know why? Because Malfoy has Charlie's letter. Malfoy has, in his possession, unequivocal, irrefutable proof that Harry had indeed conspired with Charlie Weasley to smuggle an illegal dragon out of Hogwarts. So you're honestly telling me that Malfoy had this irrefutable wall of evidence in his possession and what, he just couldn't be bothered to show it? Come the fuck on, people! By contrast, I absolutely can believe that Malfoy would have offered the letter to McGonagall, only for McGonagall to point-blank refuse to even look at it. You know why I think that? Because she's already done that before. Back in Chapter 9, when she caught Harry in the air risking his life, the other Gryffindors tried to tell her what really happened, and McGonagall flat out refused to hear their side of the story. So yes, I can absolutely buy that Malfoy offered to show McGonagall the letter only for her to not actually care. But even borrowing that, you still can't make that argument in McGonagall's defense, because in the very next chapter, only a few minutes in universe after she has this talk with Malfoy, she catches Harry and Hermione breaking curfew. No, she doesn't know about the dragon, but she nevertheless sees with her own two eyes irrefutable proof that Malfoy was at least partially telling her the truth. And does she reduce Malfoy's punishment in any way, shape, or form? Does she even so much as apologize to Malfoy for calling him a liar? Fuck no. Now, some of you might reasonably ask why I sound so angry. Why does this piss me off so much? The answer is simple. It's not so much what's happening, but the fact that the author intends for us to view it in the complete opposite light. As clearly in the right as Malfoy is in this chapter, J.K. Rowling expects the audience to be glad that Malfoy is in detention, and in fact an overwhelming majority of the audience do indeed feel happy about this. Even though this is the one time in the series when Malfoy is actually the good guy, simply because Malfoy is an asshole for the rest of the series. We also are meant to sympathize with Harry and Hermione smuggling this dragon out of Hogwarts just to cover up for their friend Hagrid, who they know full well to be a dragon-smuggling bastard fully deserving of a stint in Azkaban. Why? Because we, the audience, are meant to like Hagrid while despising Malfoy. So it doesn't matter what the facts are or what the law is. Whether a person deserves to be punished or not is entirely dependent on whether or not we like that person. If we like a person, they shouldn't be punished no matter what crimes they commit. If you personally don't like him, then by all means punish that person for the crime of being disliked by you, regardless of what they may actually have done to deserve it. And frankly, if you feel that way about this, then I'm sorry, but we cannot get along. I have previously, repeatedly and consistently invited people to disagree with me in the comments of these videos, as long as you're civil about your disagreements. I even made a 26-minute video where I explain in great detail why I demand that. But here, if you are of the opinion that whether a person deserves to be punished should be determined solely by whether or not you like that person, then you can get the fuck off my channel even if you're civil about it. In fact, it is quite literally impossible to advocate for that position in a civil manner. Oh sure, you can feign politeness, just like how this bitch is notorious for feigning politeness while being anything but civil in her discourse. But if you, in all seriousness, advocate for the aforementioned standard of justice, then you are effectively advocating for the complete and total dissolution of the rule of law. Literally everything the rule of law stands for is the complete opposite of this kind of favoritism. Honestly, this chapter would have worked so much better if J.K. Rowling had written this chapter with some degree of self-awareness. When Snape plays favorites with the Slytherin students, Rowling is quite adept at portraying Snape's actions as the completely unfair and arbitrary bullshit that it clearly is. So why doesn't she do that here? Well, I can only think of one explanation for the lack of self-awareness presented in this chapter, and that's if Rowling herself, in all honesty, was not aware of the injustice she was writing. After all, show of hands, how many of you never noticed how unfair this chapter was until just now when I pointed it out to you? How many of you completely believed that Malfoy was honest to goodness getting his comeuppance for being such an asshole? I'd have to imagine that the overwhelming majority of the audience ended up actually drinking the Kool-Aid. so I can only imagine that Rowling must have similarly been blissfully unaware of the blatant double standard she was writing. However, as someone who sees the double standard for what it truly is, I cannot, in good conscience, sit back and just not call foul on this. In any event, the chapter comes to a close with Harry and Hermione getting caught by Filch on their way down from the astronomy tower, with the narrator explaining that they had accidentally left the invisibility cloak atop the tower. So this chapter, there was honestly no real advancement in the main plot. The primary contribution was Harry getting caught breaking curfew, which came at the very end of the chapter. This is only significant because it sets up Harry's detention in the next chapter, which is where the plot will actually advance. This chapter, however, is more focused on setting up the next contribution to the main plot, rather than actually contributing anything to the main plot directly. The Golden Trio all effectively receive their character development together through the same collaborative efforts. They all join Hagrid to see the dragon egg being hatched. They all try to persuade Hagrid to get rid of Norbert. They all collude with Charlie to smuggle Norbert out of the castle. Ron sits out the actual smuggling, but only because he's hospitalized. The only one who gets any unique character development is Harry, who displays the leadership he first displayed back in Chapter 9, when he's the one who comes up with the plan to send Norbert to Charlie. Other than that, the Golden Trio tend to act as one group in this chapter. Hagrid comes out of this chapter looking the weakest. Not only does he commit an imprisonable offense by smuggling an illegal dragon egg, but he completely abandons his gamekeeping duties to take care of it. I get that his life's ambition is to own a pet dragon, and he's delighted that he gets to live that dream even for a little while, but this comes at the expense of his common sense. Now, I can't really be too hard on him in this chapter because, unlike McGonagall, Hagrid's ineptitude in this chapter will eventually get a payoff in the final chapter of this book when he realizes just how much he screwed up. McGonagall once again comes off like a complete and total bitch. By contrast, Malfoy ironically comes off as the most righteous, seeing as he is attempting to stop a crime from being committed. Even if he's only doing this in order to get Harry Potter expelled for no other reason than he just doesn't like Harry Potter, I'll still take that over a complete lack of accountability any day. This honestly would have been a great way of giving Malfoy some depth, if not for the fact that the irony of the role reversal and just how unjust it was seems to be entirely lost on J.K. Rowling as well as the majority of the audience. Well, ladies and gentlemen, next time Harry will serve detention, and for the first time in the series, we'll meet Voldemort in the flesh. So tune in next time when I review Chapter 15, The Forbidden Forest. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.